On a cold winter afternoon in 1999, 14-year-old Christy Reed arrives home from school to find Paul Powell, her sister Stacy's friend, open the door for her. When she asks him where Stacy is, Paul replies casually that she's in her room. Christy doesn't think too much of it because Paul often hangs out at the house, but today something doesn't feel right.
I saw there was yellow tape around my house, and I'm thinking, oh God, something's seriously wrong.
I couldn't scream, I couldn't cry, I couldn't find any of my emotions.
When police arrive at the Reed home, they find one of the most disturbing crime scenes the state of Virginia has ever seen. 14-year-old Christy survives the horrific crime, determined to ensure that the man who attacked her pays for what he did to her family. Yet, in a twist of fate, it is his own words that ultimately serve as the nail in his coffin. January 29th, 1999. 16-year-old Stacy Reed lives with her mom, Lorraine, her mom's fiance, Robert, and younger sister, Christy, in Manassas, Virginia. The Reed household is a welcoming place, and friends of Stacy and Christy often come and spend time there. The girl's mom, Lorraine, treats these young people as her own children, and they would often join the family for dinners and even trips. Stacy had met 20-year-old Paul through a friend whose brother was friends with him. Paul was interested in dating Stacy, but she wasn't into him.
He was a 20-year-old young man. His dad, I believe, was an alcoholic. Paul was the middle child. We found out at the first trial that he was a white supremacist, self-proclaimed. He was a self-proclaimed member of the KKK. He was always stealing. He'd spent a stint in jail for contributing to a minor and writing hot checks. But nothing to the extent of what he did to the girls. And they really didn't know what pushed him over the edge.
Stacy had recently started dating Sean, a young African American.
So one of the young men that hung out at my house was Sean. He was African American, he was like one of my kids. Yet Paul became very jealous of Sean, and mainly because he was African American.
The relationship between Sean and Stacy upset Paul because, as he would say later, he didn't agree with interracial relationships.
He takes rejection personally and says, well, if I can't have you, nobody can.
Robert was Lorraine's fiancé and a wonderful father-like figure to the two girls. He had a great relationship with Stacy and Christy and was even closer to them than their biological father.
He got home before I did. He always did.
Okay.
And he came home and found the tragedy.
At 4:15, Robert arrives home from work and can't find either of the two girls. He looks for the cordless kitchen phone, but he can't see it in the kitchen. Thinking that Stacy must have left it in her room, he goes searching for it to put it back on the charger. He finds neither the phone nor Stacy in her room. But then, he enters Christy's room. It's dark in there, so he turns on the lights and sees Stacy's body on the floor. She's not breathing, and there's blood on her clothes. He rushes out looking for the phone to call for help.
Still looking for the phone, and so he knows there's one downstairs in the basement. So he's running down the steps to get the other phone when he hears something, and it sounds like it's his name being called, but it's really distorted. Mm-hmm. And then when he goes into the basement, he finds Christy. She's conscious and she's trying to talk, but she's losing a lot of blood. She's going into shock. When he found her, she had 3 bicycles piled on top of her nude-bound body, and she's trying to call out for help. She kept rolling her head back and her eyes back, trying to get him to notice the phone. Uh-huh. He finally picks up the phone, calls 911, and as soon as the operator asks, this is 911, what's your emergency? The line goes dead. The phone's been off the charger too long, and it's completely dead.
Robert goes back to Christy to comfort her, but he knows that if he doesn't get help, it might be too late for her. Terrified that the man who did this to her might still be in the house, Christy is anxious to get out. Robert tells her that there's a phone across the hall and he has to get to it, but Christy pleads with him not to leave her. Robert is starting to become fearful because his life could be in danger too. He finally gets to the other phone and discovers that a 911 operator is trying to call back to make a connection again after the first call had cut out.
When the police arrive, they come in with guns drawn, ready to shoot him. And he's trying to plead with them, please, I'm trying to help my daughter. You need to get us an ambulance. And they finally realize that he's not the person of interest.
When police get to 14-year-old Christy, she is still breathing, but she's barely hanging on. Her injuries are critical. She's making distorted noises and going in and out of consciousness. But when a police officer asks who has done this to her, Christy mouths two words with conviction: Paul Powell.
Stacy was stabbed in the chest, piercing her heart in 2 places. Christy was sexually assaulted, strangled, stabbed, both of her wrists cut and her throat slashed repeatedly, and left for dead. But they told us later that her esophagus and vocal cords they thought had been severed, so she would never talk again if she did survive, and that her spinal cord had been severed in 2 places from the stab wounds in her abdomen, so she would likely never walk again.
Police arrest Powell that very evening at the home of a friend. They find a blue bag that belongs to him. In it is a pistol, a survival knife, and a butterfly knife. On the survival knife, they find a dark reddish brown stain. DNA testing would later reveal that this was the blood of Stacy Reed. Powell is taken into custody and is interviewed several times. He admits to the crime, but keeps changing the details. First, he denies assaulting Christy, but then he admits to it. He tells them that during his argument with Stacy, Stacy attacked him, scratching his face, so he pushed her to the floor. He claims that Stacy attacked him again, and that she got stuck on his knife. He also tells police that he had to kill Christy because she was the only witness to the crime, and he would have to go to jail if she was free. But detectives can see that Powell's story isn't adding up. Why did he wait in the house for 2 hours after killing Stacy if it was an accident? Why were there weapons in his blue bag? Authorities also find that Powell had stalked the family for 2 weeks prior to the killings, watching their comings and goings. The day before the killings, he had visited the Reed household, as he often did. But this time he had walked in the hallways, looking into the rooms and checking the layout of the house. The evidence points to one thing. This was a cold, calculated killing, not an argument gone wrong. Meanwhile, defying all expectations, Christy has survived the attack. Doctors are amazed at her recovery and just how narrowly she escaped permanent physical damage.
So she was in on Friday, and the following Friday she was released, walking and talking with no disabilities. And the doctors were astounded. She had 60 stitches in her neck. She had 25 staples in her stomach from where they opened her abdomen to find out what vital organs had been damaged. The spinal cord was never touched.
Powell had missed her spinal cord by just 1 centimeter. But the mental and emotional wounds would last for a long time. That Saturday, they buried Stacy, a week after the killing. It was young Christy's bravery and strength to face her attacker in court and her eyewitness account that eventually led to his conviction. She identified her attacker and told them how he had taken her down into the basement, assaulted her, bound her with her own shoelaces, and strangled her. She told them how he had stabbed her in the stomach, slit her wrists, and slashed her throat. The prospect of seeing Paul during her testimony terrified young Christy, but then she thought of her sister Stacy and knew she had to do it for her. On August 10th, 2000, more than a year and a half after he had killed Stacy and viciously attacked and violated Christy, Paul Powell was sentenced to death in Prince William County Circuit Court. But then something happened that no one could have predicted. Virginia, like many states, distinguishes between different types of murder, with capital murder being the most serious offense that is eligible for the death penalty. The distinction between first-degree murder and capital murder is significant, as only capital murder carries the possibility of the death penalty under Virginia law. But to convict someone of capital murder, the murder has to involve specific aggravating factors. One of these factors is murder that occurs during rape or attempted rape. Unfortunately, prosecutors couldn't prove that Powell had tried to rape Stacy. Although he had raped Christy, Powell had never admitted that he had tried to do that to Stacy. In other words, he didn't meet the requirements necessary for the death penalty. In 2001, the Virginia Supreme Court threw out Powell's death sentence, ruling that the murder of one girl and the assault of another could not be considered the same crime. Powell had escaped the death penalty sentence on a technicality. But then, in a twist of fate, Powell wrote a letter that would change everything.
So Paul sent me a letter to my house, giving great detail what he had done to Stacy and why, and what he had done to Christy. He mocked us. He thought that he was off the hook for the death penalty, so he was confessing everything, thinking, well, since you can't do to me what you wanted to do to me, I'm going to tell you what really happened.
In the mocking and profanity-laced letter addressed to his prosecutors, he says,
"Since I have already been indicted on first-degree murder and the Virginia Supreme Court said that I can't be charged with capital murder again, I figured I would tell you the rest of what happened. You should have known that there is more to the story than what I told by what I said."
In the letter, Powell finally outlines everything that happened the day of the killing. When Stacy had walked to her room, Powell had followed her and began insisting that she had sex with him. He had not mentioned this to authorities previously. Stacy refused, but Paul pins her down on the bed and sits on top of her, demanding that she sleep with him. "We can do it the easy way or the hard way," he tells her. Powell ends the letter with the taunting words,
"I guess I forgot to mention these events when I was being questioned. Haha. I can tell you what I just told you because I no longer have to worry about the death penalty. And y'all are supposed to be so goddamn smart."
While the details are harrowing, Powell doesn't realize that he has made a crucial mistake.
I had this instant revelation that, wait a minute, he's confessing to something that we couldn't prove in the first trial.
Paul believes that he can't be retried for the same crime, but he doesn't realize that double jeopardy doesn't apply in this case, because having a conviction overturned by a judge is not the same thing as being acquitted by a jury. The prosecution would still be able to try Paul for first-degree murder, or again for capital murder, should new evidence emerge. When Powell gloated that he had tried to rape Stacy, something he hadn't admitted before, he had just handed prosecutors exactly what they needed to try him again for capital murder, and once again seek the death penalty. He had given them evidence of a murder committed during an attempted rape. The judge called for a new trial. Once again, Paul Warner Powell was facing capital murder charges. On January 13, 2003, Powell once again went on trial for the capital murder of Stacy Reed. Powell's letter confessing his attempted rape of Stacy was introduced as evidence against him. During his first trial, Powell had been arrogant and belligerent, openly threatening Christy Reed and taunting the whole family. But this was not the case at the second trial. Powell was now an emotional wreck. He cried openly in court and remained silent throughout most of the proceedings. He knew that this time, there was no getting out of it. In the second trial, Powell's own words would become the most damning evidence against him. His letter and other letters he had written to the Reed family while in prison, and the manner in which he had bragged to other prisoners about killing and assaulting the two young girls, showed his complete lack of remorse. The jury found Powell guilty of capital murder, and he was sentenced to death, this time with no escape. Finally, justice had caught up with him. Powell was given the choice between the lethal injection and the electric chair. He chose the chair. On the 18th of March 2010, 11 years after the murder of Stacy and the horrific attack on Christy, Paul Powell was executed. Lorraine and Christy watched through the viewing gallery, finally able to close this painful, tragic chapter. Lorraine and Christy would go through a long, difficult process of healing. Lorraine's faith and her ministry would be essential in this process. She eventually forgave Paul and even reached out to him before his execution.
And I said, I forgive him. I forgive him. And I just broke down and cried. I feel at peace.
Lorraine established the Stacy Foundation, which stands for Stand Together Against Crime Every Day. This organization is dedicated to providing support and advocacy for victims of violent crimes and their families. Through its efforts, the Stacy Foundation aims to raise awareness about the impact of violent crime, promote victims' rights, and work towards the prevention of such crimes in communities. As for Christy, the road wasn't easy. At one stage, she battled drugs and alcohol in an effort to overcome her trauma, loss of her sister, and survivor's guilt. But then she turned her life around, entered rehab, and got clean.
But one of the amazing things that happened after that was that she met a young man named Jason. They met, started dating, and he was with her through the rehab. And she told him, she said, if you're not here when I get out, then I'll know you really don't care. And he was, and he's still there. The doctors had told Christy when she was in the hospital that she would likely never have children if she did survive, because the sexual assault was so abusive. And in 2014, she called me and she said, Mom, are you sitting down? And I said, what's the matter? She says, are you sitting down? I said, what's the matter? She says, I'm pregnant.
Today, Christy is a loving mother of 3 beautiful children. She wears her scars as a reminder of her strength, calling them her battle scars. She supports other victims of violent crime, helping them to find their strength. Christy would provide support to Crystal Searles, another girl who faced a similar fate, sharing her story, telling her about her injuries, and how she faced her sister's killer in court.
And he strangled me. He slit both my wrists. You can barely see them, thank God, they're going away.
When Crystal asks if she has any tips for her before she faced her own attacker in court, Christy says,
I don't know, because I really didn't have anybody help me. I just had to do it on my own. But just concentrate on her, because you're helping her and yourself. Think that she's still here and helping her. It's scary, but once you get it out, you feel a lot better.
I am out at her house now. I just went in her home because I'm so worried about her. There is blood everywhere.
This 911 call was made by Valerie Hawthorne. Concerned that her coworker, Tina Herman, hasn't shown up to work, she goes to Tina's house to check on her. What she finds inside is one of the most shocking crime scenes in American history. 4 people are missing, and the house is covered in blood and gore.